How's it going, everyone? So I want to kind of show you a quick overview about how sessions work. And I'm not going to use any type of plugins or anything like that. I'm just going to use Express, kind of walk you through a little simple setup. So hopefully it can help you understand more about how sessions and cookies and a basic type of authentication might work. You need to use your imagination and expand upon this idea, but this is like the fundamental idea of how a server session might work to kind of keep you logged in. All right, so we have an Express app here, and hopefully you're kind of familiar with Express, where you import Express, you set it up, and you can start binding endpoints. Okay, so right now we have a login endpoint that a user can do a post request to, and we also have a to-dos endpoint that a user can do a get request to. This endpoint is authenticated, meaning that you have to be logged in to get the data back, and this endpoint is how you actually authenticate. All right. So let me talk you through how the login endpoint works and kind of show you like how a session works and how cookies work. So over here in Postman, we can do a post request to the login page, and we can send some body and also provide some JSON in the payload. So I can provide a username and a password. So if I were to provide a bad username and a password and click send, you'll notice that I get back 401 unauthorized and invalid username and password. So if I type in the correct username and password, this should all work. And what's going to happen is we actually get back a 200 status code, a success message. But the most important part of this login page, if you're doing server sessions, is if you look at cookies here, we now got back a cookie. Maybe I can collapse this. We got back a cookie which has some type of unique identifier for me, for this user who tried to log in. So this ID is kind of the identifier for your session. And you might ask, okay, how is this cookie actually sent back? Well, you have to understand how headers work. So when you do a request to an endpoint, you have the ability to send something called request headers, which is basically just key value pairs, right? You can just send some data to the backend. The backend can process that and do something with it. But what can also happen is on the response of the server, which is this tab, the server can actually send back headers to the browser and tell the browser to do certain things. Okay, so there's a bunch of different response headers that come back, but the most important one that we want to talk about is this set cookie header. So if set cookie is sent back, what the browser does is it takes this string and it stores it somewhere in the browser's memory. Okay. I shouldn't even say memory. It stores it in its cookie storage, which I think is persistent. Even if you close your browser and reopen it, this thing is still going to be stored in your browser. We're using Postman right now, but you can kind of use your imagination and apply these same principles. So after you actually click the login endpoint and you provide the correct username and password, the server sends back a set cookie header, and this Chrome browser / Postman is going to save that. Okay, so if I look at cookies now, I have one cookie called session, and it has some information about it, right? So this has a session key and a value that has a unique ID. So this ID is kind of my special login token. It's like my key to my locked front door. If I provide this unique ID to the backend now, I should be able to authenticate with other endpoints. So let's kind of look at the code and understand how this post endpoint actually work. So right here we have the express binding for a post request to /login. And once you've done the request, we are going to get the username and password from the body of the request, right? So remember, over here, I sent in a username and password. So that's going to check to make sure that the username and password are both set to admin. And if I didn't correctly set the username and password, then we send back a 401 unauthenticated or unauthorized, whatever you want to do. And again, like these things would not be stored in plain text. Use your imagination. This is just an example. I'm just trying to show you the most basic session setup. So if you are correctly authenticated, what you do is you create a unique ID for that user. So I'm importing a package called UUID which allows you to generate these long, you know, it looks like a random string of characters. This is called a UUID version of v4. And you generate that ID, and that's going to be your session ID or your session token. And you need to save that somewhere on the server. So what I did in memory is I just have an object called sessions, and I'm just saving that UUID as a key value pair where the value is equal to the username. And I just went ahead and hard coded a user ID. But obviously, if you have this connected to a database, you'd actually get the username and password from the database, verify the user sent in the correct username and password, and then you'd get the user ID and whatever other information you might want to keep track of in the session. Usually the most important thing about this session is you keep track of the user's ID, okay? Because you're going to need this to be able to fetch to-dos related to them, to upload to-dos and put their user ID on it, etc. Allow only certain users to update certain to-do items. Again, this is like a to-do list example, but this applies to basically anything when it comes to secured web applications. All right, so let's go to the cookie part. So remember I said if the server sends back a set cookie header, this is how you set cookies in Express. You say res.set. You tell it which cookie key or which header key to use. So we're going to say set cookie. And then we are saying use this key value pair. And then send back a success message. So again, like if you look at the headers that come back, you see there's a set cookie and we have a session. All right, so that's literally how you can do login, right? If you're doing a server session approach and you want to use cookies, this is how you can do it. Super simple. And there's plugins that do this for you already in Express. I just wanted to show you like the bare minimum so you understand how cookies work, how headers work, and how like a basic authentication might work. So now let's move on to how do you actually use that session to fetch to-dos from an authenticated endpoint, right? So we have another endpoint called app get to-dos. And if I go over to Postman and I hit this endpoint, so let's just go ahead and say send, I want to show you that if you look at the actual request, if I look at the hidden, you'll see that this has a key called cookie in it, right? So every time I make a request to any endpoint that has this same host name, localhost 8080, Postman or your browser is going to automatically attach that same cookie that you set in your cookies. Okay, remember the browser just keeps track of this and it's always going to hold on to it until you manually delete it. So every request from now on is going to automatically append that cookie to the request and send it over. Okay, so if we think a little bit, use your imagination, that means that our endpoints can actually parse this and figure out what the session ID is of the request. So let's go back over here and look at how that happens. So we get the headers from the request, get that cookie header, because remember this is called cookie, and then we split it on the equal signs and we get the second. So this is really hacky. I would obviously use a plugin or a library to do this for you because this is probably error prone, but I'm just showing you it's super easy to get that session ID. And if that session ID is not set, we're going to send back an unauthorized session error. So let's just show you that real quick. If I go to cookies and I just go ahead and delete that cookie and click send, notice that there is no cookie in the header. Let me do it again. I think all right, so again, like I said, this is pretty error prone. I need to actually say, maybe I can put a question mark there. Let me try this. There we go. All right, so this is a little bit more, not as brittle, but if that cookie is not set, as you see in the headers, we're not setting that cookie. The backend doesn't actually have a session, so it's going to go ahead and just throw an error because it's like it doesn't have a session ID. So how can I authenticate this user? Let's go back and just log in real quick. Click login. That'll set the cookie on Postman. Click send. I'll get back that actual data. So now, once we've verified that the user does have a session, and that session is actually proper, right? You could set whatever you want on your browser's cookies, but the session has to be something realistic that the server knows about. So the server set this session ID inside its session store, and we need to verify that it actually exists. And if it does, if the user provided a correct session ID, or if the user provided the correct key, in a sense, this is again a key to your front door. If you provided the correct copy of a key that the front door, aka the server, knows about, then you can actually send back the data. Okay, so what we kind of do is we use that session, and the session actually has more information about the user. So it has like the user ID, it might have some other stuff like special configuration or options that the user has for your application. But we get back the user ID, and typically what you do is you do like a database query using that user ID that was in the session, and you get back all the items related to that user ID. In our case, we're just sending back some hard-coded array of to-do list items, and I just put the user ID here to just show you that like we didn't specify user ID 1 anywhere here, right, in our request. There's no user ID 1 in the URL. There's no user ID in the body. There's no user ID in the cookie. It's just a session ID. But the server knows about the session, and the session cookie or the session ID maps to a user object that has that user ID. So that's kind of like the overview of how server-side sessions with cookies kind of works. I know I didn't give you like an actual production-ready, realistic view, but the idea was just to kind of teach the basics of it so you can kind of, take this a couple of steps further. Now, there's also the idea of like, how do you log the user out? Well, you probably just add a login endpoint. I'll do that real quick. So you say log out is a post request, and all you need to do is if there's a session set, let me go ahead and do this. Sorry, this is going to get real hacky real quick. I'm going to go ahead and get that same session ID, and I'm just going to go ahead and say delete sessions of session ID. And then what we can also do is I think you can say res.set cookie, and I think we can say session of null. I didn't really prepare for this, so let's see if this actually works. I think this will kind of null, clear out your session on the browser. So let's try this. Let's go back. I'm going to go ahead and click logout. Let me do this, post request to a logout endpoint. And if I check my cookies, I do have one set for session. And if I do a post request here, we get back success, 200 status code, look at cookies, and it is still set, but notice that it's set to null. Okay, so now if I were to try to hit that same to-dos endpoint, it errors out because we don't actually have a valid session ID. There might be other ways to actually delete this cookie from the headers, but I'd have to go Google that. I don't really remember off the top of my head. Maybe Copilot can tell me. Yeah, maybe just do something like this. There's like a lot more you have to do. You have to do something like that. Set it equal to empty and then tell it to expire. So let's try that real quick. I'm going to click log out and see if my cookies gets cleared. Okay, so that's a proper way to do it. Don't set it equal to null. Set it equal to empty and then give it like an expires at from 1970. But again, what I'm trying to show you is that like to log out, the server basically just deletes this information about that session. And then you tell the browser to also delete the cookie. So now neither the server or the browser kind of knows about this session ID, and you have to re-log in to be able to hit these authenticated endpoints. Now, a couple of things I want to talk about is typically this thing is going to be stored in a database or like Redis or some type of memory cache. Because if you have a ton of different servers, let's say you have 10 different Express servers behind a load balancer, that means that every time a user tries to hit your endpoints, these sessions are going to be stored in different like objects. So this is not going to work on a production application. You're going to have to actually keep your sessions stored in a centralized place. All right. And that kind of opens up a can of worms because now you have like all these different load balance servers all trying to connect to a centralized location to get the sessions. And that can cause some performance issues, which is why the whole concept of JWT was invented, so that you don't have to have these things stored on the server side. You just have like this token that you send back to the client. That token already has a user ID in it. and the server has a way to verify that the token is proper. We won't get into JWT in this talk, but I just want to let you know that, like, again, what I showed you is not production ready. There's some other tweaks you have to do to make this like work properly, but this is the main concept of server-side sessions and cookies. So if you enjoyed watching this and I kind of taught you a little bit about something new, give me a thumbs up, leave me a comment, be sure to subscribe. Also join my Discord if you want to ask me questions directly or kind of like talk to anyone else who's in my community. Anyway, have a good day and happy coding.